Good morning and thank you. So this is the session on planning for climate change, and we have a number of talks on lessons learned from shoreline stabilization techniques, the need for wastewater treatment planning, and to minimize the occurrence of sanitary overflows. We'll also be talking about ecosystem-based carbon sequestration and how that can enhance restoration and climate resiliency within the Bay. Our first speaker is Tom Ries, and he is the Southeast Biological, he works with Southeast Biological Services and Restoration Director for ESA. Take it away, Tom.
Good morning. I'll be the first speaker of the day, so it's always a little bit of pressure on that. So I would like to talk to you about living shorelines and what we've learned over the years. And in this conference, you're going to have papers ranging from really technical, a lot of data, a lot of good information. You know, with living shorelines and putting projects in like this, there's not a lot of funding for monitoring. Okay, and so there isn't any monitoring. We have a lot to learn on these things. And so this presentation is just all anecdotal information. But it was important for us to see what is working and what isn't working. So this paper is going to be co-authored by myself and Bryan, Flynn, the coastal engineer at ESA, as well as Tampa Bay Watch, Serra, Herndon, and Eric Plage. So next slide, please. So we're going to talk about some older projects first. So this is down in the Bradenton River, off of the Manatee River. It's a little breakwater in the back there. And you can see the developed area in the middle, and maybe this, I can show you with the pointer right there. That's a school Girl Scout camp. And then there's this little notch on their property around this river. There never should have been a seawall, next slide, in this location. There's no energy, right? There's not, you're not even on the main channel of the river. There's no room for open water fetch. It was put in, it was in there for many years. And so with the Girl Scouts, they didn't have the funding to repair it. And so we came in working with the Sarasota Bay Estuary program saying, let's take this out. We weren't calling these living shorelines in the day. We were just trying to make it a natural shoreline because it didn't need to be that way. So we took that seawall out, and this is what it looked like 1 year later. And 11 years later, it still looked like that, except the mangroves are taller, because that's what it should have been looked like and probably looked like before. So we know they work in these quiescent areas. So how do they work when you have some real energy involved? Next slide, please. This is an aerial view of the Hillsborough River downtown, right at, if you're familiar with it, the North Boulevard Bridge. And that area on the south is Stewart Middle School. It's almost 2,000 linear feet of shoreline along the river. And that had a major escarpment, a lot of erosion because of the numerous boats that go down this river. Next slide, please. Working with the Water Management District, we were going to try and make it back to a normal shoreline. And most importantly, the school couldn't get any of the students down there. No way could this be a learning lab for them because they couldn't even see the river because there was a whole line of lead trees along that entire length, as you can see in this photo. And so we tore all those out. It's very limited, a lot of infrastructure in here. Next slide. And so we had, this is our basic shoreline design or cross section. It's riprap, revetment on the bottom. It's only 2 feet wide on the top and 1 foot above the natural ground. We keyed it into the ground, put a little trough behind it, and then we have a slope between 2 to 1, 3 to 1, or 4 to 1 because of the infrastructure constraints. And for all those areas, we use GeoWeb and Coconut Map because it's so tight. Next slide, please. And so on the, when you'll see here is it's under construction. You know, this is a typical area. This is the most steepest area. So we use GeoWeb and use it as a terracing, as you see in the photo to the right, and planted all that. And next slide. And this is what it looked like, what it looks like 5 years later. And today, 9 years later, it still looks the same. You can't see the rock really. It's holding the shore. And if anything, there's more boat traffic in this area than before. And what makes it worse, on either end of this project is a no wake zone. So all boats are powering up or powering down on both ends of these. And in spite of that kind of wave energy, this is holding. So this works in a boat wake driven area on this river. So we're happy to see that. We're happy to see that it's working and it's still working today. Next slide. All right, so let's go to a little bit higher energy. This is down Sarasota Bay. There is the Bayfront Park. If you can see that triangle up there near the top and that red dot, that is a public property. And we're again working with the Sarasota Bay Estuary program, we wanted to put a living shoreline demo project in so people know that there's options instead of a vertical wall. Next slide, please. Now, this site doesn't have super high energy, but if you can see in the middle of this photo, there's an opening directly out to the Gulf of Mexico. So if that wind is coming from the southwest, you're going to have some energy hitting this shoreline. Next slide. So this is Tropical Storm Debbie, and you can see there's a lot of energy here. A lot of boats got dislodged in here. Major erosion to the shoreline. Next slide. It actually lifted up the sidewalk that was on here and busted up. Next slide. And so it was in pretty bad state just from that tropical storm. This is not even a hurricane. Next slide. So this is what it looked like when the city was done replacing the sidewalk. And we said, look, we got to do something here. There's not a lot of room. You can see there's some small rock in here. So we used that and there's some additional rock. I made a small line of revetment on the shoreline and planted it. And this is what it looked like, a year later. So this is looking good. We have a sign up there talking about natural shorelines and what kind of plants you put in, et cetera, and trying to just highlight living shorelines in general. So the next slide. So then we had its first big test in 2017. When this hurricane hit Sarasota, there was sustained winds of 75 miles an hour. Next slide. This photo was taken the very next day. Sorry for the bleached out color, but you can see not only is the sidewalk still intact, the shoreline held. We did have to add some more plants, but it held. And so this was a good test for us because we were a little worried that the rocks that we used and the size weren't substantial enough to hold it. Now, I'm going to say all the projects I've talked to you about so far, we did no modeling for, okay? We didn't try and figure out the exact wave energy that's coming in. We just seated the pants. We think it's going to work. Let's put it in. And these worked, and so that's good, but they don't all work, okay? And so next slide. I'd like to talk about some other projects working with our partners, co-authors here for Tampa Bay Watch. You can see the two yellow dots on here. I zoomed really far out on this in this image because I wanted to show how much energy these sites have. Whiskey Stump Key, which is a lower dot, that has 13 miles of open water fetch if the wind's coming from the southwest. Fantasy Island, which is to the north of it, that has 25 miles of open water fetch because you can line of sight right past Egmont out to the Gulf. So rarely do they have energy, but when they do, they can have big energy. So this is a high energy situation. The last thing here in the middle of the photo, that's MacDill Air Force Base. I didn't put a dot on it, but the southern and the whole eastern side of that, we're going to talk about the shoreline work that Tampa Bay Watch did out there. Next slide. So Tampa Bay Watch has been on the water for many years, and they know the bays really well. And so they could see the erosion that's happening at Whiskey Stump and Fantasy Island. It's substantial. Even when there were the portions that had mangroves, they were all undercut because of the wave energy. Next slide. So what they did is they just started with oyster bags, okay? Put in arrays of oyster bags around the island, and they held for a while. But we finally get some big storm, and it's too much energy for them. So they're out here, Tampa Bay Watch is out here watching these things and seeing how it works. And you can see how the bags in the background here are almost gone because of the wave energy. So it's adaptive management. Okay, let's go. What's the next step up? So oyster domes or oyster balls were used in the next photo here. So you can see they put this triple line of these oyster domes out around the entire island. And behind it, you can see the remnants of the oyster bags. But what you also can see is the marsh. Okay, now the marsh is actually holding. So that was the next step up, and that's all it took. By just putting these oyster domes in, which were the concrete and the weight of them, okay, these weigh over close to 100 pounds, that's what it took to protect that island from high energy. So this is Fantasy Island. Let's look at next slide. Will show you Whiskey Stump. Very similar situation. You can see in the middle of the picture the oyster bags that got a little beat up before the oyster domes were put in. And now, next photo, you can see that they're working. and there is no more erosion, and the marsh and the mangroves are thriving. So again, just trying to see what works and learn from it. And you can see what, in this case, with this big energy, what it took. Now let's go to MacDill Air Force Base. That is, again, another high energy area. And for years, Tampa Bay Watch has been putting oyster bags out there and trying to plant behind them. And it would hold for a while, and then they would eventually have too much energy. So again, lessons learned, they went in and went to the next step up, oyster domes. First, they tried them further apart, and then they started realizing they work really well when they're clustered tight like this. And so I think that's how they modified the design and put them in. And so next slide, you can see how well these work. Okay, now the marsh is holding. It's all it took. So in some places, oyster bags work fine, and in others, of course, oyster domes are what you need. Next slide. I want to talk about this more recent project up in Safety Harbor. Now, this is one where we have about 7 miles of open water fetch from the east. And so this is, I zoomed out just again so you can see the amount of energy out here. So this one, we actually had the luxury of being able to do coastal engineering on it to assess what's really going on and what kind of waves are going to come in for, if we have the worst case, what are the prevailing winds and waves for the last 100 years. So we're going to zoom in where it says Safety Harbor, and you can see the pier that sticks out here. You can also see the existing seawall. The other white line behind it is the fence. Now, this is a 140-foot seawall that was deteriorating. Next slide. And the city was going to replace it, and it was going to cost them close to $200,000 to put that wall back. We worked with them and got funding from the Estuary program to say, let's do something different here. I know this is moderate to high energy, but I know that we can come up, if we do the analysis, we can come up with a design to take this out. Next slide shows the wall as it's looking to the north. And so next slide is before and after. And so all we do is take the seawall out. Now, that doesn't mean you rip it out of the ground. We just cut it at the mud line and use that what's left of the seawall as a footer to build what you see here, which is rock revetment. Again, this is too high energy to just put plants in. So with the modeling, we knew what we needed to do as far as rock and the weight of the rock. And so this is when it was right after it's planted. Next slide. A couple of pictures at low tide from the pier. It's hard to see in here, but you can see the oyster bag array was used as a footer at the base where the old seawall was, and then we packed the rock above it all the way up the slope. All right, it held fine. Next slide. Until we had Hurricane Irma. And Hurricane Irma was really tough on the site. For 2 days, we had 40 to 50 mile an hour winds coming directly from the east, where this is the most vulnerable site. This was a picture taken the day after the hurricane. Now you can see how above the rock, yes, there is a little bit of erosion, and yes, we're going to have to replace a few plants. But it held. Okay, everything else held in place, no erosion. While the photo to the bottom is that same fence as it goes to the north, and you can see the boards were ripped out. That's how high the energy was there. The rack line was halfway up the field. There was a lot of energy here, and it was almost a 4-foot tidal surge into this area. So these do work. So I guess the lesson learned for us is adaptive management, right? It's just what you got to do when you do projects like this. And if you have the funding to do the coastal modeling, then you can pretty much say, we know exactly what the weight or orientation placement of this material needs to be for it to work. So that's all I have on the presentation itself. We are continuing to do these projects. We have about a dozen more we're putting in the ground now, and we're going to continue to monitor them. What really needs to happen is funding to really look at these things, not only for the resiliency, but what kind of life is out there, what's really working, and which one of these models works best. And so that's happening. Pinellas County has some funding for that. So well, hopefully we can have a presentation to have some real science behind it to show what works, so we can use that and apply it for future projects. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. I neglected to mention at the beginning, we're going to hold questions till the very end. We've had a slight change to our schedule, and so the presentation by Brooke Hansen is not going to happen. So we're going to hold questions till the end and have a panel discussion, and you'll be able to ask questions to everyone you hear this morning at the end of the session. Our next speaker is Dr. Steve Meyers, and he's currently the Chief Scientist at the Center for Maritime and Port Studies.
Good morning. Today I'll talk about a project we did looking at the effects of sea level rise on the rate of sanitary sewer overflows in southern Pinellas County. I want to mention my PIs on this, Shawn, Landry, Mark Luther, and Marcus Beck was also a co-author. I don't know if he's in the room, so apologies. Your name should be higher up. I also want to mention our partners from the Tampa Bay Estuary program and the city of St. Petersburg. Click. So these overflow events, which, oh, go back one. There was a little animation there, are associated with extreme weather, particularly those that bring compound flooding, which is when you have high precipitation and around the same time as you have high storm surge. Okay, click. And the way to understand why weather causes these events, you got to kind of literally dig into the ground here. So all, or not all, but many homes and businesses have their sanitary systems connected to the utility lines, utility pipes, through these so-called lateral lines, right? And then the larger pipes then convey that waste to the wastewater treatment plants. Problems are occurring because this is starting to age, right? So you're getting cracks and breaks in the line so water can get in. Right? So when precipitation comes down, right, it can go different places. Here on the coast, or it can flow off the surface to the ocean because, you know, the ocean is at a lower level than this and then the land, so you have this pressure gradient. It can seep into the ground or it can go into the pipes. And generally it doesn't go into the pipes except during certain conditions. So when we first started this, we figured it was just compound flooding, but there's one more key factor there. So when you have compound flooding, the sea level comes up because of the surge. So you reduce that outflow to the ocean. And so the water can then go into the ground or into the pipes. Well, if the ground is already saturated, if it's been a lot of rain already, then there's a lot more pressure going into the pipes. And you get these kinds of effects you're seeing here pictured. Right. Click. What is this? Is that something I can get rid of? Well, so what happens if you get too much water going into the lateral systems and flowing into the treatment plants, right? It can overwhelm the capacity of the system. So then you get overflows, which either spill out onto the surface, which is kind of what you're seeing here, and yeah, that's not clean water, or it can winds up getting shot into the aquifer through deep well injection. So I've talked about this project a couple other times. Where I've gone into the mathematical and technical details. We're not going to do that today. We're going to keep it conceptual. We'll talk a little bit about the methodology, just kind of the essentials of what we need for today. And then how we applied it to examine the effect of sea level rise on the future rates of these sanitary sewer overflows, or SSOs, as well as kind of doing a retrospective study looking at is it already having an impact? Okay, click. So in the last few years, there's been growing awareness and concern that these events seem to be increasing. And it's not just locally, it's throughout the state. And in fact, it's throughout the country or coastal regions. Click. So this is a chart from Hummel. It's a few years old, but the basic results still hold. This is a breakdown by state of the number of wastewater treatment plants that are threatened by sea level rise of various levels from 1 foot to 6 foot, and then the corresponding population that is serviced by those facilities. So one click. So Florida is tied for second with New Jersey, New York being the most threatened. Click. Now that's just a static measure of risk. It's just the mean sea level. but we know from experience that it's really much more dynamic. I mean, it's weather related, right? So there's winds and tides and rain. So click. Right. So what we did is we used a machine learning algorithm. I'm going to gloss over that for today. I'll get to that in a second. But we've already established that what we're looking at is compound flooding plus saturated soil leading to these SSOs. And like any good machine learning or artificial intelligence tool, you need what's called training data. So in our case, it's the historical record of events. And so, sorry, go back. So we get that data from the tide gauge at St. Pete. That gives us our surge. Precipitation from NextRad. We also use cumulative precipitation. That's a proxy for the saturated soil because there's not good data on that. And then we compare that to the records from the wastewater treatment plants supplied to us by the city. Okay, click. And we looked at these records from 2000 to 2017. And there's a lot of spills. Most of them were very small. Most of them were not weather related. So when we narrowed down onto the weather related non-mechanical failures, we only found 6 scattered among the 5 different treatment plants in southern Pinellas. Okay. One more. So the method we used is called logistic regression. It's a binary classifier, meaning that binary is like 0 to 1, yes, no, or in this case, spill or no spill. Right. And again, I can talk about the details of this offline, but what you want to for today, one click, is that this is a probabilistic model, right? It's not going to tell you definitively if you're going to have an overflow or not. It's going to give you the probability of an overflow. Okay, click. So this is our hindcast, right? The black line is the probability over time, and the vertical axis is the probability 0 to 1, right? And the vertical dashed lines indicate the dates of those 6 large overflow events. And you can see that the agreement is pretty good. And so that gives us a lot of confidence that we're on the right track here, and we can use this model for other kinds of studies for the purposes that we want to use it for today. So if we want to look at the number of events in the future, all right, we have to count. We have to come up with some sort of threshold because there's a little bit of ambiguity here, right? So how much probability is going to determine, are you going to count that as an event? Right, so in our case, one click, 0.4 worked out very well, but there's absolutely no reason, no a priori reason that that happened, right? It's just kind of a coincidence. So I'm going to track through this. I'm going to track 5 different probability levels, 0.5 down to 0.1. Right? So just keep that in mind. So the first question that we're addressing here is how will sea level rise impact the rate of SSOs in Pinellas County? And the way we did that is we took that tide gauge data, having trained the algorithm already, then we add in sea level rise to that tide gauge data and rerun the model. Okay, click. Okay, so this is the plot that you just saw, right, with our thresholds indicated. The amount of sea level rise is indicated on the top. So one click. So we add in 10 centimeters. You see we're getting increased probabilities. Click, 20 centimeters, click, 3 more. Well, okay, 1 more. So now we're going up to 50 centimeters of sea level rise. Depending on which prediction you're following, that could be as soon as 2050. So we see that there's a lot more likelihood of these events occurring, right? And we can count the number of events above each of the individual thresholds. So 2 clicks. And we can track them. So there's a little bit of difference for each threshold because the lower thresholds count more, the higher thresholds count fewer, but the trends are all the same, right? That is, it's showing a doubling of these events with every 10 centimeters of sea level rise. So if we're not careful, we're going to go from conditions where we're having these events once every few years to several times every year. So then here's the opposite question. It's actually something Ed asked a while back, is can we use this model to better understand the effect of sea level rise on the events that have already occurred? All right, so basically we invert what we did. Instead of adding in additional sea level rise, we take it out. But how much do you want to take out? Do you want to take out the last 10 years, 20, 30 years, right? So we kept that as a variable. And click. So again, here's our original plot, and we've just numbered the events chronologically just to keep track of them. Okay, click. So as we progressively went back further in time, taking out more and more of the historical sea level rise, we kept track of the probability of events, right? And so here's the numbered events. And see that even if we go back, say, 20 years, which is, 0.05 meters of sea level rise, right? The probability of 4 of the recent 6 events decreases very rapidly. Okay? And the other 2 slowly trail off. So this suggests that concerns that sea level rise have been triggering these events. It's well justified. Click. Boy, I went through this pretty quick. Yes, it took longer at home. So yes, climate change has been having an impact on our infrastructure here in Pinellas County, and it's going to continue to have an impact. In fact, it's going to have an increasing rate of impact in the coming decades. So this absolutely needs to be taken into account in planning of future facilities. So we don't go from a case where it's very rare to very common. Now, there are efforts being made already to get ahead of this problem, to increase the capacity of the wastewater treatment plants. That's kind of outside my area, but I will refer you to the Wastewater and Stormwater Partnership for further details on that. Now, one thing that I thought I didn't have time to go into was that this is a very seasonal event. These events are very seasonal. So when we say that we're going to go up to approaching, say, 5 or 10 events every year down the road, that's not spread out evenly over the year. That's concentrated into the later part of the wet season, right? So we're talking about 10 events concentrated in over, say, a couple months, right? So that is a big burden upon our utilities, and something that really needs to be kept in mind. Okay, click. So I'll just leave you with a few additional references. We published a paper on this last year in Urban Climate, as well as links to some interactive modules that Marcus put together for us. And you could try those out. They're a lot of fun. Those are interesting. You can see how we also added capacity for not just sea level rise, but precipitation as well. So you can see how those 2 effects interact. All right, thank you.
Thanks, Steve. And once again, if you're just joining us, we're holding questions till the very end. We are missing a talk today, so we will just have a panel question at the end of the session. Our next speaker is Dr. Randy Parkinson. He comes to us from Florida International University, where he's a research associate professor at the Institute of Environment.
Good morning. So next slide. So this is a 3-year project that was completed in 2020, funded by the Indian River Lagoon National Estuary Program. And I want to shout out, it was done in partnership with the Balmoral Group. They're located in Orlando, Florida. Next. So what is a climate-ready estuary? Well, what we figured out, and it should be common sense, although if you try to Google what it is, you won't get a definition necessarily, but it is a watershed that's managed to ensure the effects of climate change on water quality and ecosystem function are mitigated through purposeful actions designed to reduce future pollutant loadings from anthropogenic sources. Next. So this results of this 3-year analysis are available through the IRL as Technical Report 003. It's also been published in the journal Coastal Management. I think that came out last year, the details of this. What this is really about is how does one approach determining what risks your estuary is to facing, and how you deal with that in terms of adaptation actions that then you strive to achieve. Next. So what we did was we looked at the CCMP that was being written at the same time the project was launched. So we sort of had a moving target, but in the end, they finalized and approved their 10-year comprehensive conservation and management plan. And we were trying to figure out, well, what effect will climate change have on their ability to achieve the intent of the plan? Next. So the RL's CCMP is organized around this vital signs wheel. So the wheel has this concentric circles of different levels of hierarchy, but the ones that are most important for this are the 2 outermost. Easy. So there are 5 categories: water quality, habitats, living resources, healthy communities, communicate, collaborate, coordinate. So those are themes behind which then they have specific objectives that they want to achieve in order to accomplish a goal. So the 3 that were at risk to climate change of significance anyway: water quality, habitats, and living resources. 3 of the 5 where they had objectives that they were striving to achieve that were be compromised, which I'll explain. Behind each of those are these vital signs, and there are 32. So you have water quality, and then you have, say, wastewater. Go ahead. Is a vital sign, and then wastewater has 1 or more objectives. How are we going to address issues related to wastewater just as it exists today? What we're trying to figure out is, how does this get complicated in the future because of climate change? So here, for example, is one of the objectives in wastewater, and there's probably 100 different objectives throughout this wheel. So the objective, they want to reduce the principal source of pollutants from septic and wastewater treatment plants. Well, septic and wastewater treatment plants are at risk to climate change. So therefore, that goal, that vital sign, and the CCMP's ability to achieve its wastewater goals could be compromised. Next. And in fact, all of the vital signs associated with those 3 are at substantial risk to climate change. So what are those risks looking at? How do we try to figure out what we can do to mitigate that? So what we did is we looked at the major categories. There you see water quality, you see habitats, living resources. Those are the 3 categories. And the vital signs within them, such as wastewater, and the objectives within those. We then looked at stressors. So we considered all of the litany list of climate change stressors, and we narrowed it down to 5. Increases in temperature, changes in the frequency and intensity of precipitation, intense storm events, acidification, pH, and sea level rise. And then we looked at the level of risk, because not all risks are the same. And what do I mean by that? So highest, there's no low here, by the way. It's high, higher, and highest. So a high risk would be, it might happen to one taxa at a very small location 20 years from now. At the other end is highest. It's already occurring today. Numerous species and water quality, whatever, is being affected, and it is going to make a huge difference. So then we ranked each of the risks to the climate, between 1 and 3, 3 being the highest. And so we got scores. So here you are, 400 372 risks to the CCMP generated by climate change. 370 were determined to be of highest risk. So what do you do with that? Do you have 472 action plans? I mean, what do you, that's just an enormous lift. What we noticed is 50% of the stress came from impaired waters, wastewater, stormwater, surface water, the risks to those. And when we sort of dug in on this, what we realized is, you know, if we address those, the constructional effects of that will cascade down through all the other objectives. So we don't have to look at all of them. We focus in on the ones that are most at risk, and next, see, 58% of the highest risk. So we've narrowed it down now to three elements of the comprehensive management plan. And next, what we find out is 97% of that's coming from three of the five climate change stressors. So we targeted, you know, water quality and the impacts of changes in precipitation, storminess, and sea level rise. Next. Here's an example. So this is in that publication. There's the bottom, the Journal of Coastal Management 2021. So what do you have in the left column there is what are the three stressors, and then the three targeted vital signs here shown grouped in wastewater, which is the wastewater treatment plants, the on-site storage and treatment systems. That's of course sewer or septic, and then the stormwater storage and conveyance systems. And then if we look at how the stressors are going to impact that, first is precipitation. So I go over to stormwater. How will increases in precipitation affect stormwater conveyance and storage systems, and then aggravate? Well, they saturate the field or the domain, and if you have septic tanks within that, or you have stormwater wastewater treatment plants within the domain, and these can be huge, and those fail, then the water that is being conveyed through those and towards the estuary is contaminated. With regards to storminess, you know, a lot of septic tanks, especially old ones, are built in low-lying areas. They might be near a shoreline, so you get temporary saturation during storms, heavy rainfall. The drain field is saturated, the zone of percolation, and the thing fails. Or your shoreline erodes and exposes the field or the tank. Sea level rise, looking at a wastewater treatment plants, many of these along the East Coast are basically at sea level, certainly in the Inner Lagoon. You'll get permanent flooding and physical damage associated with increased rises in sea level. So this is the sort of matrix that we looked at to come up with the 472 or whatever, and ultimately 9 adaptation actions, 3 for each of the stressors and 3 for each of the targeted vital signs. Next. So what is the best path forward? In Brevard County, Indian River County, Indian River Lagoon in general, there's enormous efforts going into mitigation restoration. There are 3 that I'm going to go over specific to the lagoon, and I'm going to put these into this graphic here, where on the bottom it's time since construction. So you construct it, and then you have time moving along the x-axis. And on the y left are the pollution reduction benefits from lower to higher, and then the cost on the alternate y-axis. So next one. So this is living shorelines. Color intensity is proportional to performance. So as the performance increases, the color intensity increases. So you install a living shoreline. This is the low-hanging fruit. Pollutant reduction benefits are low relative to the others, but it's cheap. Thousands of, 10,000, 100,000, depending on how long and how big and so forth, as we heard earlier today. So you install it. It takes a while for the shoreline to perform its function. It doesn't immediately take nutrients out of the water column. It takes time. It takes time to recruit oysters, to filter. So let's just say that that's occurring. And I saw a poster out here from Eckert. They were doing some work there, and they said, it was like 21 years, and they really hadn't seen the kind of maturity in the forest, the mangrove planting restoration that was analogous to a mature. And this is the at issue here. We don't even know how long that takes to occur. So the performance at so many dollars per cubic feet is for a mature functioning. How long does it take to get there? Living shorelines are extremely important for a number of ways. They are a placeholder to address the immediate challenges. They are excellent for public education and outreach, but they will not solve the problem on their own. So let's just say we have them there, then we get a hurricane. So what erodes, as we just saw from earlier talk, the shorelines, which is where the living shorelines are. So they get damaged, as we saw. Some are recovered, but that sets back the ability of it to perform its duty to pull out nutrients. And eventually we have sea level rise. The majority of the photographs that were shown and anything, they're behind a rock revetment, a seawall, steep incline, because it was eroding to begin with. They have no place to go. And the rate at which these wetlands can accumulate is slower than the rate of sea level rise. So their performance is maybe mid-century, which is okay. Then we need to be thinking about the other two that are going on. Muck removal. So muck is, I was just down in West Palm in Lake Worth Lagoon yesterday or day before, a lot of muck. Muck is an anthropogenic sediment. How many of you heard about it? Most people have now. It's everywhere, and it covers the bottom. So you don't have any benthic function. It aggregates contaminants of concern. It gets stirred up in the water column. It moves around. It's a mess. So muck removal has been going on. It's extremely expensive, $50 a cubic yard. Beach nourishment's $20. It's very expensive. So let's say you remove the muck. So it takes a while for the system to sort of figure out it's been removed. Then you have a hurricane, which are increasing in frequency, intensity, is concurrent with climate change. So these are going to be, stirs all that up, puts it right back where it was. And so you reset. Plus, we're not removing the source of the muck, which is sewage treatment, septic, it serves water conveyance and storage. So until we deal with that, muck isn't going to help us in the long run. Sea level rise will, because it will reduce the frequency in which the muck is redistributed, but it's not a long-term solution. So the last one is infrastructure. Designing and building new infrastructure. I'm talking about removing septic, dealing with your stormwater conveyance and storage systems, your sewage treatment plants. We have to completely redo that in a way, presumably they're designed correctly, will be climate resilient. You build it, it's going to take a while for the legacy loads to flux through, but eventually they will perform throughout their design life, 75 years or more. Next, the bottom line is to reduce water quality impairment. We have to deal with aging and failing infrastructure with the priority implied here, stormwater, storage and conveyance numero uno, and then septic and wastewater treatment secondary there. Next, require billions of dollars and decades. Chesapeake Bay, 15 billion, 50 years. That's what we're looking at. It's a huge commitment, but that's the only way we're going to get there, to get a climate ready estuary. Thank you.
We're going to move ahead to the talk by Dr. Kara Radabaugh from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute. And she is going to tell us about blue carbon.
Good morning. So I'm going to be talking about blue carbon stocks in Southwest Florida mangroves and salt marshes. And I'd like to acknowledge my collaborators on this project. This is part of a larger effort with Eastern Carolina University, University of Central Florida, University of South Florida, as well as us at Florida Fish and Wildlife. Next, please. So this study focuses on blue carbon, and this is the carbon that is captured and stored in coastal and marine ecosystems. So carbon is taken up by plants during photosynthesis. They store this carbon within the biomass of the plants, but it's also stored within the soil below ground. So in coastal wetlands and mangroves and salt marshes, they create large amounts of peats. This is highly organic soil. This is created both through surface deposition of decaying organic matter and sediment being deposited on the surface, but more importantly, through the roots of the plants. As the roots die, the organic matter in the roots remains underground for long periods of time due to slow decomposition due to lack of oxygen in the peat. And this organic matter can remain for hundreds to thousands of years if the ecosystem remains stable. Next, please. So the objectives of the study was to determine the amount of above and below ground carbon stocks in Southwest Florida coastal wetlands. And we were aiming to link field-based measurements to remote sensing data. Next. In order to create region-specific models predicting carbon in salt marshes and mangroves. And then we were going to examine the temporal stability of carbon stocks with things like habitat replacement and sea level rise. So in order to determine how much carbon is out here in the marsh and in the mangroves, we did some ground truthing. So we established 10 by 10 meter plots. In order to quantify the amount of above ground carbon, we are measuring the plants and using allometric equations to calculate the amount of biomass. So for the trees, we measure something easy like the diameter of the trunk, and there are published allometric equations to relate that trunk diameter to the biomass of the tree. And from that, we can calculate how much carbon was in the biomass. For the salt marsh plants, we made our own relationships, allometric relationships between the length of the stem of the plant and the biomass of the plants. And then from the density of all the plants and measuring the length of all those plants, we can then calculate how much biomass and how much carbon is stored in the plants. Below ground, we're taking sediment cores using a Russian-style peat core. We take that back to the lab, slice it up in 1 centimeter increments, and combust it through a loss on ignition process. The organic matter burns off, and the weight loss, we can determine how much organic matter, and then from there calculate how much carbon was stored below ground. So we did a lot of work ourselves, but we also took advantage of the fact that there are a lot of other published blue carbon data sets out there. They are available, many of them through the Coastal Carbon Atlas. So we can combine data available through that atlas as well as through some other published data sets. And this map is showing all of the ground truthing data that we have across Southwest Florida between our work and the work of others. The white circles are showing above ground carbon ground truthing sites. Black triangles are the below ground carbon ground truthing sites. And blue is showing how much mangrove is in the area, and orange is showing salt marsh. So we want to fill in between the gaps of where all our ground truthing sites and model how much carbon is found everywhere in the ecosystem in Southwest Florida. So to create the model, I used a random forest model in R. So this is a classification algorithm that consists of many decision trees, and it's nice because it allows for nonlinear relationships between the predictors and what it's predicting, in this case carbon. And I made separate models for above and below ground carbon and created this at a 30-meter resolution. The possible predictors included all of the available Landsat 8 bands, the normalized difference vegetation index. This is like an indicator of greenness of vegetation, elevation, and some published models that are also available for the region, including tree canopy cover and mangrove height. So I took all of the possible predictors, put them into R, analyzed them using the random forest method, and then in the graph on the far left there, that's listing all of the possible predictors that I fed into the model. The top 4 predictors were the most important and are what I used in the final model. So that included soil depth. So for predicting soil, I'm actually predicting the soil carbon density at each depth within the soil up to 1 meter of depth. So there's the most organic matter near the surface of the soil, and it generally declines as you go deeper. So soil depth is the #1 most important variable here. Band 7, that's a shortwave infrared. That provides an indication of things like moisture and plant presence. Band 7, the thermal infrared, it provides an indicator of surface temperature of the soil, was also a really useful indicator, as well as mangrove height in one of the published models by Simmerd et al. So in the center graph, just using, that's showing what the model looks like using those top 4 predictors. And that's showing how well the calculated carbon density is modeled. And I reserved 1/3 of the data points and then applied that same model and tested it on 1/3 of the data points. And that's the cross-validation data set shown in the 3rd panel. And the model responds really well while testing it against the cross-validation data set. So I can then apply the model across all of Southwest Florida. And I'm doing this in these 30 by 30 meter pixels. So in this panel here, I'm just zooming in on a section of mangrove forest in Tampa Bay, and it looks pixelated because those are the 30 by 30 meter pixels. And I can model what is the carbon density at the surface, 15 centimeters depth, 30, 50, and 100 centimeters depth. And the amount of carbon, it declines with depth. So the colors are changing and becoming more purple, but less yellow with depth. That's just showing there's less carbon with depth. And then I can integrate how much carbon is present across all these depths to figure out what's the total carbon stock up to 1 meter of depth. So this is what the maps look like for Tampa Bay and the 10,000 islands. A few things to note: Tampa Bay, it's a relatively thin margin of coastal wetlands surrounding the bay before you hit either development or upland. And also the below ground carbon stock, it's around the 250 megagrams per hectare range. So it's not very high carbon stocks compared to what we see in Southwest Florida, further south in the 10,000 islands. So that's a much wider band of coastal wetland vegetation and much higher carbon stocks that we see going up to 400, close to 500 megagrams per hectare in that first meter of soil. And also notice that carbon stocks are much higher near the coast. This is where the tallest mangroves are found. And then as you go further inland, the mangrove height declines and it transitions into salt marshes further inland. So I made a separate model for the above ground carbon stocks. There's far fewer data points here. It's a lot of work just to get one carbon stock for one plot here. So far fewer data points, and it's just one data point per location rather than pouring down on the sediment and looking at all of those different intervals within the sediment. But the most important variables here for predicting above ground carbon are ecosystem type. So that is just binary. Is it a mangrove or is it a salt marsh or a transitional habitat? Tree cover was also very important. The normalized difference vegetation index, as well as mangrove height. Again, one of the published models. So again, I created the model using 2/3 of the data points, tested it on 1/3 of the data points. So this is the above ground model that I used using those 4 predictors. And this is what the maps look like for the above ground model. So darker colors are showing more carbon stored above ground in the biomass. And again, in the 10,000 islands, we see there's a lot more carbon stored in those tall mangroves near the coast compared to the salt marsh further inland. So where is this all going with climate change and sea level rise? There's many different factors at play here for carbon sequestration. One of them is mangrove expansion. So mangroves are increasing their area and taking over salt marshes across Florida. And they're moving both northward due to the lack of cold events that would normally freeze the mangroves and kill them off. And they're also moving landward due to sea level rise. So we can easily see this in satellite imagery. This is an image from the Little Manatee River in 2002. You can see the salt marshes. They're just, this is a Juncus salt marsh, which is showing up hopefully in brown. And then the mangroves are that green fringe around the edge of the river. And then just last year, almost half of this area is now dominated by mangroves, and they're taking over that Juncus salt marsh. So mangroves do store more carbon than the salt marshes, both above ground and below ground. So if we were looking just in terms of mangrove expansion, this would imply that we're going to see more carbon storage due to this mangrove expansion in Florida. But that's not the only factor at play. This map here is now showing we're just adding together the above and the below ground carbon stocks. And again, you can see there's a lot more carbon stored right on the edge of the coast in those very tall mangrove forests. But they're also going to be highly impacted by sea level rise being located right there on the coast. So these mangroves need to be able to keep pace with sea level rise. I mentioned they're forming this peat below ground, so they actually can increase the elevation of the forest over time, both through surface deposition, but also through those roots growing. The elevation is increasing over time, but that elevation increase needs to be able to keep pace with sea level rise. Whether or not it is highly variable, depends on the mangrove, the location, the rate of sea level rise. In many cases, the mangroves are keeping up right now, but as the rate of sea level rise increases, models are forecasting that once sea level rise starts to exceed 6 millimeters per year, which may occur in 30 years under high emission scenarios, then these mangroves are no longer going to be able to keep up, and they're at risk of drowning and being converted into some sort of aquatic habitat or tidal flats. In addition to sea level rise, they have other chronic stresses they have to cope with, including altered hydrology due to all the roads that are being constructed, as well as, of course, the Everglades have highly altered hydrology. And they also have to deal with acute stress, such as hurricanes. So they are right on the forefront of hurricanes like Irma. This area was highly impacted by Irma. The image here, this is of mangrove forest in the Keys, and it's showing this area in particular was highly eroded due to Irma. But even if the forest itself isn't initially eroded and losing the peat due to erosion, if it dies due to the hurricane or altered hydrology or sea level rise, if the forest dies and that peat starts to decompose, then you see the peat's elevation decrease and we see peat collapse as that organic matter decomposes and that carbon is again released up into the atmosphere. So the future is by no means certain for the carbon stocks in Southwest Florida, but they are quite large carbon stocks, and it's going to depend on a lot of interacting factors of what is going to happen to these carbon stocks. So I'd like to acknowledge our funding from the USDA, and I guess we can take some questions at the end of the session. Thank you.
Thank you, Kara. Our next speaker is Dr. Ryan Moyer from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, who is also me. I don't know. I'm used to giving lectures for 2.5 hours with this thing on. Can everybody hear me? Yeah, good. Okay, good. First, I'd like to acknowledge my co-authors. Everyone is here today. I haven't seen Christine. Has anybody seen Christine? No. But I do encourage all of the co-authors to participate in the question and answer session by answering questions at the end. And what I'm going to try to do is bring this session a little bit full circle. We started out talking about restoration, and Kara just gave a very nice overview of some blue carbon work. And I'm going to try to tie the last thing you heard with the first thing you heard. So this is everything you're going to see in this presentation is from 2 recent papers that were published by the group, including a mangrove stress paper from Kara, and then work that was done by Emma Dontis as part of her master's thesis. So next slide, please. Okay, so Kara laid out the blue carbon situation really well for everyone, and you can go to the next animation. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so these systems are really good at storing carbon, and most of that is below ground. And I don't expect you to be able to read that tiny little graph at the bottom right. But what that's telling you is that most of the carbon stored in these systems is below ground. There's quite a bit above ground as well, but it is far outweighed by the amount of carbon stored below ground. And this is useful because what this is doing, it's a long-term sink for carbon dioxide, which is a problem in the context of climate change. So this is drawing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, converting it to biomass, and then storing it, as Kara said, for hundreds to thousands of years, depending on the stability of the system. And next one. That is what we've been looking into in Tampa Bay as part of this Tampa Bay Blue Carbon Project. And this was featured in the textbook on blue carbon, a blue carbon primer. And we have suggested that this is something that will incentivize restoration in the future, because if you're getting all these climate change benefits out of creating living shores and things like that anyway, that is a good thing. So that can help incentivize restoration. Next, please. Yep, there we go. So where to begin? Why do we need to restore? Many of you have probably seen this before, but you can't really touch a mangrove or a salt marsh in Florida without finding some sort of hydrologic impairment. In most cases, that's a mosquito ditch. And these things are kind of just living on the edge, and they look fairly healthy, but then it just takes one event to drive them over the edge. And stressed ecosystems can then turn into these things that we call mangrove heart attacks, which was Robin Lewis coined that term. And so this modified hydrology is a major stressor, and you can see that in the images at the bottom right. Those are these typical discolored pools of standing water. They're so prominent, you can actually see them and identify them from space with aerial and satellite imagery, and that's what we've done around Tampa Bay. So we worked in a number of different stressed mangrove environments, which you can see at the map on the left. And we also compared them to reference sites. And next one, Ed. So, and Kara just did a really good job describing peat collapse to all of you. So you're familiar with that term now, and I don't have to describe that, but that is a major risk. If you are losing the peat, you're losing the soil, and that is where all of the carbon is stored. So you're losing those blue carbon benefits with these disturbed or these hydrologically impaired sites. And so early identification and restoration can prevent this and make sure you're getting your full blue carbon benefits. Next slide, please. So we investigated this, and what you're looking at is just a table of data comparing reference sites, which are healthy mangrove sites, non-hydrologically stressed, to hydrologically stressed sites, and trying to put some actual hard data. We can all see the visual cues. We can see the discolored pools of standing water. We can see the adventitious root growth, which you're looking at the bottom right image. But this is some actual numerical data that you could go out and you can measure and potentially detect. If you don't have these visual cues, you could still detect whether stress is present or not. So we know that these systems have less dissolved oxygen in stress sites. We know that the concentrations of total and dissolved organic carbon in the pore water is higher at stress sites than reference sites. So that gives you a good indication that the carbon that is in the soil is actually leaving the soil, breaking down and turning into a liquid phase, basically. And there was no difference in salinity between our, so it's not, this is hydrologic stress, but there's really no salinity stress or any other combined factors. And again, the visual cues are the adventitious root growth and the discolored standing water, but if you would prefer to actually numerically identify this, these are some of the things that you could look for. And you can actually see it in the soil. What you're looking at in the bottom middle is a core of the peat below one of these hydrologic stress sites, and there's no soil there. It's a lot of roots. So if you go to the next slide, and if you compare, you're looking at the same image now at the top right. That is a core from a hydrologic stress site versus a reference site. You can actually just see there's physically more sediment there. The graphs at the bottom all are distance from the water body. So either at the reference sites, it would be a non-discolored pool of water, open water, whatever you have, or distance from the hydrologic stress, that pool of water. And you can see that the closer you are to the impaired water, the more different the sites are. And you're looking at percent organic carbon at the very left, and those are significantly different between stressed and reference sites, with hydrologic stress sites having actually more organic carbon, yet less soil. If you look at the dry bulk density is significantly lower, closer to the, at stress sites, closer to the water body. And that's because mostly what you're looking at in the hydrologic stress core is just live roots and not actual soil. You're already seeing the early stages of peat collapse. And we can see that with the plot on the right. There's no significant difference between root growth at stressed or at reference sites. So that gives us a way to identify and actually quantify stress in these systems, and that can help to prioritize restoration. Go ahead to the next one. Because we have, and as you know, Tom told us about in the first talk of the session, we have, you know, restoration is key in Tampa Bay. And if you click to the next one, there has been quite a lot of it around Tampa Bay. And the green colored circles, that's what color they're showing. Yeah, that's green-ish. Those green colored circles are estuarine restoration, and that's really the color that stands out at you. Most of the restoration in Tampa Bay has been in the tidal frame. And so if we can quantify and identify these priority sites that are hydrologically stressed and in need of restoration, these are the ones that are losing those blue carbon benefits, and we may be accounting for them, and they may not actually have as much carbon stored as we need. So those are the ones that really need intervention quickly, and we need to go in and we need to do restoration. So let's go to the next slide. But, and this is from the latest Habitat Master Plan update by the fine folks at the Estuary program. And if you click the next one, we'll get highlighted here are coastal wetlands, mangrove forests, salt barrens. You probably can't read any of those numbers, which is okay. The idea is that the 2030 and the 2050 targets are the same for mangroves, and they're only slightly different, slightly higher for 2050 than they are in 2030 for salt barrens and salt marsh. Most, you know, we're running out of room to restore these systems. So we really need to identify the ones that are stressed so that we can restore them and get those blue carbon benefits from them. And we're kind of really running out of room to do that. So if we can have a way to identify and prioritize these, that is that helps make everyone's job a lot easier. Next. So then we transition into the work done by Emma Dontis, and look at, so she's actually looked at the carbon burial and the efficiency of carbon burial at restored coastal wetlands around Tampa Bay, because we do have this long history of restoration in Tampa Bay. And so the map is the sites that were considered on the left, and these were broken up into young sites, which were 0 to 5 years old, middle-aged sites, which were 6 to 13 years old, and old sites, which were older than 14 years since restoration occurred. The middle plot in all cases is showing more carbon stored below ground than above ground, with the exception of the older sites, which actually had nearly equal above ground and below ground carbon. But generally, the older sites are storing more carbon, a lot more carbon. So, and Randy alluded to that in his talk, that these things take time, and you're not immediately getting those blue carbon benefits. It's going to take time. The older sites are older than 14 years, so we're talking at least 1 to 2 decades. And that's what you can see in the plot at the right. It's site age along the bottom, and then you're looking at organic carbon storage, and you can see a very, very, very strong, significant positive relationship where you get more carbon storage as the site gets older. So if we plan now, we may not be getting our blue carbon benefits and our climate benefits for another 2 decades or more. Okay, next slide. So Kara also mentioned that at the same time all of this is going on, we're having mangroves sort of replace salt marshes. And that is another big issue with our restoration. Maybe click to the next one or the next one. All right, I guess I have that in another slide. That's okay. So, well, now we have the whole slide in front of us. What you're looking at in all 3 plots is site age along the bottoms, the same as you just saw on the last slide. Site age on the bottom. You're looking at diameter at breast height, which is the diameter of the tree that Kara told you about in her talk. And you see that the trees get larger with site age, and there's almost no trees. The restoration paradigm in Tampa Bay is typically you plant salt marsh because it's cheaper, easier, and higher degree of success, and you're going to get mangroves anyway. But if we look at these plots, there's almost no trees at the youngest sites. The diameter at breast height is nearly 0, and the mean tree height, which is the middle plot, is also 0. And the trees come in as the site ages. You also see on the right that is salt marsh above ground biomass, and that sharply declines as the site ages. So this is good quantitative evidence. Actually, this is kind of okay though, because mangroves actually are more efficient at storing both above ground and below ground carbon. So over time, you're getting more realized blue carbon benefits, but you are losing a pretty critical habitat, and that is your salt marsh and your salt barren. So if you're prioritizing carbon, you're doing okay as the site ages, you're storing more carbon, but it also is something to realize that it's going to take a long time. Again, at least 1 to 2 decades based on our data, but probably even more. To get these climate benefits from your ecosystem. So if you want to start trading carbon credits and things like that, that becomes pretty important to realize, because you may not actually be getting what you're paying for or what you're getting credit for 30 years down the road. All right, next slide. And as if that weren't bad enough, we have done some what's known as habitat evolution modeling, or created these habitat evolution models, considering blue carbon habitats going forward as sea level rises and climate changes. And what we see is that if you just look at the image to the right, what you're looking at in red is mangrove loss. And so these systems are potentially, because of climate change and tidal, climate change and sea level rise, you could potentially be losing these ecosystems. All right, next slide. And so just to conclude, these stress systems are at the risk of peak collapse, and you're going to be exporting carbon dioxide, methane, dissolved organic carbon, things that are not great in terms of climate. The habitat restoration can reverse the hydrologic stress, and the blue carbon is a reason to do the restoration. But these oldest restoration sites are the ones that are most efficient. So again, it's going to take decades to reach their full blue carbon potential. At the same time, climate change and sea level rise are threatening all this, and you may be losing more than you're gaining. So that makes a strong need to identify and prioritize what needs to be restored now so that we can plan for the future. And all of the other speakers did wonderful staying on time, and of course I broke that trend. But I had 2 jobs, so I'd like to acknowledge everyone that made this possible, especially our funding sources and our field helpers and people that helped us get access to the land. With that, I think we're going to open the panel up to questions for everyone.
Thank you. What a great panel. Thank you. My talk to the University of South Florida. I have 3 questions. One, what's needed to get to 100% resource recovery from wastewater in Florida to eliminate the amount of discharge to surface waters or groundwater? And is anywhere integrating recovered resources with production of mangroves needed for living shorelines? Second question, for Tampa Bay sites identified for restoration, how does prioritization consider issues of equity? And third, TICO speaks of carbon neutrality, and getting there requires some offsets. So what is the business case for Tampa Bay to involve an industrial entity like TICO in funding some of the blue carbon restoration initiatives?
Okay, where should we start with that? I'm looking at Tom.
Can you hear me okay? All right. I couldn't hear exactly all the questions that were said, but I'll take the one I did hear. You know, social equality and where these projects go is an important issue. In the past, most of these projects were done of habitat of convenience where there was a good project to be done or partners, and it was not taken into consideration of equity at all. Just where can we put a project, and that's where we're going to do it. But that has changed. And not only from the funding sources, making sure that people are looking at this, but also the project managers themselves are looking at projects. So we can get these important projects done no matter where they are, right? And in some cases, that's where they should be concentrated because they haven't been done in the past, and there's a lot of opportunities to do that.
I can also, in terms of equity, so we just got an EPA contract that is doing a shoreline feasibility in terms of where to put living shorelines that goes beyond the traditional matrix and includes not only the topography of the land, but also diversity and demographics. And as was just pointed out, any federal contract now that you are trying to pursue or grant will have an issue that you will be rated and ranked according to your ability to convey. This is being seriously considered, and it's not just a line you put in the proposal, but what you have to demonstrate you're achieving. And that will take, not only will we identify this, but the next is to communicate with those communities to get their buy-in. So that's the next step. But the first one is just simply considering, and then that will be used in prioritizing where to install these, not only for resilience, but for equity. So that is, as was pointed out, that's a big, big push now in any kind of federal environmental restorations kind of contract. So,
Yeah, I'm going to follow you. The one about carbon neutrality with TICO? Yeah, can you repeat that?
I was just wondering if you guys are involved in discussions with TICO on this so that you can get funding from them. They've given a presentation at the Tampa Mayor's Sustainability and Resilience Task Force, and they're talking about offsets. So the question was like, if Tampa Bay isn't supportive, can they get offsets in some of the places where they also have utilities like parts of the Caribbean that might be more committed to doing some of this?
I don't believe any of us have contacted TICO. And we also the first question, I don't think we. Okay. Other questions?
Yeah, I've got a question for Randy. In your, right here. In your presentation, you showed infrastructure and you had the graph of, you've got costs of thousands, millions, billions. And I'm wondering if in comp plans and in that planning process, it accounts for the fact that, a lot of utilities are underground. Your potable water, storm water, sanitary sewer, communications. And that's a lot of that, the flowing parts are gravity fed. So we think of sea level rise as, well, we just build houses on stilts, but all the utilities and all the things that keep us in those coastal zones, eventually we're going to either need to, you can't dig your stormwater sewers farther down and farther down and farther down. At some point, you have to build more land, elevate the land along with the homes, or you have to retreat inland. And I'm wondering if your models or your comp plans account for the fact that, it's not just homes and it's not just buildings that have to move. It's the entire underground infrastructure that goes along with that.
So, yes. Yeah, I just did an analysis talking about underground infrastructure of the Surfside Tower. It was published in the Journal of Ocean and Coastal Management, which showed that as a consequence of sea level rise, since the building was built in '84 to 2006, sea level, which is on Barry Island, was overtopping the elevation of the basement floor 400 times a year. And we had a significant acceleration in the rate of sea level rise after 2006. Sea level rise in the Key West, Naples, Virginia Key now is at 10 millimeters a year. It's a centimeter a year compared to the historical of 2.5 millimeters, which is just going to cause this flooding and threatening of underground structures and transmissive things to aggravate. And there's really no way around that except to retreat. I mean, unless you make everything watertight. We saw the pictures of some of those stormwater underground sewage systems and so forth. They're leaky, and they are going back and trying to replace those, but it's just a very expensive task, another enormous challenge.
Well, we have a question in the chat from Dave Tomasco. He asked about muck removal as a water quality restoration option. Is there any evidence of locations where muck removal has benefited water quality? It doesn't appear to have been the case in the Florida Keys Canal remediation study, nor in most lake work. So he just wondered if there's any evidence of that.
So there's two elements of rationale for muck removal. One is to restore the benthic communities. That requires 100% of the muck to be removed, which is not ever done. The second is to remove legacy loading that's in that muck to reduce the volume or concentration in the water column. But the bottom line is that it's still there. I think it's another low-hanging fruit that is distracting us from the core issue here. Especially, I talked to John Treffry, who's the grandmother or godfather, what we say these days, of muck. And he said the distribution of muck continues to expand throughout the inner lagoon because we haven't eliminated the source of it, which is essentially runoff, terrestrial runoff from areas that have the sewage and from septic and whatever. So this is a cat chasing its tail. So I am not a strong advocate of muck dredging. I think it distracts. I'm not an advocate of putting more inlets in the lagoon or any estuary to improve circulation. I think we have to hold ourselves accountable and deal with it.
A quick comment on the infiltration and inflow into Maya's point on some of the diversity, equity, inclusion issues. I do know that here in St. Pete, there's been at least some discussions on, especially because of private laterals, and if you have multifamily units, some incentivizing of private laterals as a means to help with addressing some of the affordable housing problems that we have in the city and in the region, and as a way to incentivize owners. It's just an interesting combination of thoughts that I think warrants much further discussion. And now my question on a completely separate topic. The mangrove carbon storage, you guys drove home the point that the bulk of the storage is underground. Have any of you looked at the current regulations for mangrove trimming to see how that affects your carbon capture in those mangroves and how that may affect our potential at our current regulation?
We have not specifically studied how mangrove trimming is impacting carbon below ground. It'll naturally, you're going to lose that carbon above ground until the trees grow back. But I would imagine that as long as the forest continues to recover and thrive, that it shouldn't have too much impact below ground. But if it's trimmed to the extent that it's detrimental to the health of the forest and it decreases their ability for the roots to grow, then we would expect it's possible that it could cause peat collapse if it results in the death of the vegetation, for instance. But as long as the mangroves do recover, I would imagine that the peat below ground would remain stable.
And I can jump in and just anecdotally, we have not studied that, so we don't have any hard data on that. Most of the places I have seen mangrove trimming do not have well-developed peats below them to begin with, and they're usually along seawalls or living shorelines. And I'm not sure that living shoreline design there is set to capture a lot of carbon storage and peat accumulation. So I don't know. It's a very good question. It's very interesting. And as Kara alluded to, if you're taking away above ground biomass, then it's not getting transferred to the soil. But most of the places you see trimming going on are not places that are developing, have well-developed soils to begin with. So.
One thing regarding the incentivizing for fixing the laterals. So I have some friends near Sarasota, and they got estimates of upwards of $10,000+ to replace the laterals. So I don't know what kind of incentives are being offered, but it'd have to be a lot of money because otherwise they're going to have to carry a lot of that burden. And that's just for the externals. I mean, if the lines are broken going into the home or within the home, then that's additional costs as well. So yeah, it's going to be costly, very, very costly. Do you know what kind of incentives they're offering?
Property owners of the existing property to be able to maintain some level of the way to maintain the rent at certain levels by providing incentives elsewhere that we have
I think that's a theme that we're all going to be experiencing here in the coming years, is expanding our scope of horizons for what constitutes an environmental issue and how can we further address social problems as well as environmental problems. And so thank you, Brandon, for bringing that up. I want to give a special thank you to my co-session chair, Ryan Moyer, for really stepping up so I could run the virtual meeting this morning. It is 10 o'clock, and so it's time for a break. We'll have about 30 minutes. There's some drinks, some coffee out in the foyer out there. We'll reconvene at 10:30 for the next session, which is on ocean acidification. Thank you all. We appreciate you.